Hi, welcome to this session of WP Campus. I'm Joe McGill. I'm a web developer at Washington University in St. Louis. I'm also a core developer on the WordPress core team, and I'm going to do probably something a little bit different than the rest of the folks who have talked today have done. And I don't have any slides. I'm just going to tell a story, if that's okay. But before I do that, I want to start off by just saying thanks to the organizers of this online conference of WP Campus. I remember back in August of 2015, I believe that was the date. I looked it up. I think I'm right there. I remember seeing a tweet come across my Twitter stream from Rachel that asked us to dream with her about the possibility of a higher ed focused WordPress conference. And I may have even replied to it, I'm not sure, but it's been really cool to see just in the last couple of years that initial idea that came across in a tweet turn into the first WP Campus Online, or the first WP Campus, not online, physically in person last year, and then to turn into this first online conference, and to the Slack community that there's over 500 people that are involved. It's been really cool to see, and I'm honored to be a part of this initial online conference. And so congrats to Rachel and Shelly and Stephanie and the whole team who have helped to put this together, for making this a thing. And also thank you for, you bet. And thank you for being a good example of exactly the thing that I wanted to talk about today, which is the power of showing up, the power of what happens when somebody decides to like see a problem that, or see something that needs to be done and choose themselves to go, you know, try to make it happen. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story of my own where this was the case, and some of the lessons that I learned in the process, and include some stories from other people that I know in the process. But hopefully through the story, it's something that is applicable to something in your life, or will be inspiring in some way. And if you've got any questions in the meantime, I would love to just make this a conversation so I can see the questions sort of here on the sidebar. And if something comes up, I'm happy to answer questions. So at any rate, before I get into sort of my own story of how this applied in a situation of mine, I kind of have to backtrack to or probably around the beginning of 2012, when responsive design was really starting to hit the mainstream. There were a couple of bigger enterprise sites that were just starting to roll out responsive designs for the first time. And some of the teams of people that worked on those sites started to notice this problem, right? And that's that, that, you know, when they care about performance and best practices and those sort of things, they kept running up against this problem of images. And images were, you know, and continue to be the number one use of bandwidth on our page loads, generally speaking. And they noticed that, you know, as we design these really big visual web experiences on these big screens as designers, we would use these big images. And then in responsive design, when the layouts were supposed to be a lot smaller for like phones, especially on underpowered networks, that would be just a lot of wasted resources. And there was no real good way in the browser at the time to solve that problem, where, you know, you could serve a different size image depending on the layout of your website. And so this talented group of web designers, I would be the first to tell you they're super smart people, all of them, noticed this problem, and rather than waiting around for somebody else to solve the problem, they worked on their own solutions. They advocated for solutions, and essentially they chose themselves to go fix this this issue that was kind of their own frustration. And like I said, super talented people, really smart. But I think if you talk to to Matt or any of the crew that was a part of that process, they would tell you that like they didn't know the first thing about how do we like make HTML, how do we get something new into a browser, but they had no like previous experience to that, but they like didn't let that deter them, and they just like took off and worked really, really hard and kept pushing until finally, and it took a long time, probably about 2 years later before some of their ideas turned into an actual thing that started to land in browsers. And now, we all have responsive images in all of the major browsers, and it's because of that initial effort and those folks who decided to pick themselves and to make something happen. And that was incredibly inspiring to me. And I think that was really one of the first lessons that I wanted to kind of talk about as a part of this story, is this idea of, when you see a thing that needs to be done, not waiting around for somebody else to come do it for you. If it's a thing that you have any ability to sort of to affect yourself and to kind of go ask yourself the question of what needs to be done and roll up your sleeves and kind of make that happen. So somewhere around 2014, when this technology was kind of starting to, the new responsive images stuff was starting to get some publicity, and some of it was starting to kind of form a little bit better. I was working as a web designer, primarily a little bit of front-end development here at Washington University. And it was something that I was interested in, and I decided, something I wanted to learn more about, this responsive images technology. And so I dug in and learned a little bit about it for work, and decided to give a presentation at my local WordCamp on responsive images in WordPress. And I think it's on WordPress .tv from 2012, the St. Louis WordCamp. And it was, real basic, just my first, this is what I'm learning about responsive images. And at the time had no idea when I gave that presentation that I would have anything to do with, 2 years later being involved in actually making responsive images a core feature of WordPress itself. And if you would have told me at the time that I would be involved in that process, I would have told you you're crazy, because I had no idea what I was doing. And but sure enough, that actually is what eventually happened. And in retrospect, it was really easy to sort of look back at sort of the process of being involved in that feature of getting responsive images into WordPress, and to look back and to go like, oh, well, I can see sort of where that idea started back, as I was researching that WordCamp talk. But at the time, like it wasn't obvious. And so a thing that I think in retrospect has been sort of important for me to remember, or a lesson learned from that, is to pay attention to the things that grab your attention, right? I'll say that again. Pay attention to the things that grab your attention. It could be, things that frustrate you. It could be things that inspire you. It could be just problems that like you see that need to be solved. Those places where something really motivates you or just bugs the heck out of you, it's probably a potential place for you to engage and to potentially get involved in the solution, or in whatever that thing is. One of my favorite writers is a guy named David Dark, and he's coined this phrase called the attention collection, is what he calls it. And it's this thing that each of us has, and it's sort of our own individual collection of the stuff that happens to make it past our like just every day and sort of get into our heads that we like actually pay attention to. This could be everything from like the books we read, the films that really stick with us, the music that we listen to, all the way to, like just any specific thing that really just sort of like sticks out that you pay attention to. And there's, you know, great potency, I think, in the things that we let into our attention collection and the way that we can be critical of our own attention collections, the things that we pay attention to and don't pay attention to, and then what we do with those things. And each of us has our own individual version. And so I would encourage you to pay attention to the things that grab your attention, to your own attention collections. So fast forward a little bit, that was early 2014. Later that year, I had, at some point in the year, started paying attention to the WordPress core development cycle. Somebody, one of my colleagues had mentioned, oh, hey, there's a core dev team meeting on a Wednesday. And at the time it was IRC. Now they're in Slack every Wednesday still, where the core developers that work on WordPress like talk about what they're working on. And this idea blew my mind that like literally in real time, instead of waiting for the next, you know, major version of WordPress to come out, I could like watch those conversations. I could be a part of them. I could learn like what's happening. And so I showed up and started paying attention and learning a lot in the process. And eventually during that year, I ended up getting involved in a couple of small bug fixes. And it was, for me, I found it really fulfilling and something that I was interested in. And towards the end of that year, I had participated in a couple of little things and was interested in getting more involved in maybe a little bit bigger project, a little bit bigger topic, something that, you know, I could learn a little bit more and maybe like meet some people and that sort of thing. And I happened to hear that some members of that original group of developers who had worked on responsive images, who had by that time formed an organization called the RICG, the Responsive Images Community Group, which is now, since responsive images is a thing that is fixed, they've changed their name to the Responsive Issues Community Group and are working on really cool things like container queries. If that's something you're interested in, I would definitely go check them out. I've been privileged to be a participant in that organization as a part of my WordPress work, and it's really, really great stuff. But I'd heard that members of that group had reached out to members of the WordPress core development team about the potential of getting responsive images into WordPress. And I thought, oh, I know a little thing about that. That may be kind of a fun project to get involved in. And at the time, you know, I thought like I'd make, you know, some minor contributions, you know, maybe like just be a part of the conversation, and it would, you know, be a good learning experience. I had no idea that like I would end up being one of the kind of the lead development team members that helped to make that a thing. And likewise, about that time, I think the way that it happened is that members of this team, you know, started with is there anything that already exists that could be sort of the starting point for this feature? And Chris Coyer had written a CSS tricks article earlier that year about a real simple way of implementing responsive images in WordPress. And a front-end developer by the name of Tim Evko, who lives in New York City, had like put together a quick little like weekend project that where he'd pulled together you know, a plugin version of this responsive images idea. And Chris said, oh no, I know a guy named Tim, and he's got a plugin, and maybe that's a good starting point. And you know, I think if you talk to my friend Tim and you said like, you know, at the time like, oh, you know that this code is going to end up being like a major feature in WordPress in like a year and a half, like he would have gone like, no, you're crazy. And similarly, and but that's what happened. That's exactly what happened. And you know, I ran across a quote. I'm not exactly sure who it is that said this. So if anybody knows, feel free to post it in the channel here on the side. But there's a quote that I ran across that said, "Don't compare your beginnings, don't compare your beginnings to other people's middles." And I think sometimes we maybe have an idea of something that we think needs to be done, but we don't think we have what it takes, or we don't think that we have the capabilities to even start whatever that thing is. I'm sure if you talk to Rachel and her team, there were probably times where they were like, we don't know how to start a conference, you know? But oftentimes it's because whether it's, you know, we're going to start a new running regimen, or, you know, start a new hobby like an art project or something, it's that like we look at people who have been doing it for a while, and we compare ourselves to like we couldn't do what they're doing, and we're comparing ourselves to somebody else's middle, and that was a good lesson for me, like looking back on this process is, you know, Tim started with just this small little bit of code that turned into eventually this feature, and it's a really cool process. So so I remember, you know, finding out this was happening, starting to get involved, taking a look at that that initial plugin idea that Tim had pulled together over like a holiday break. I think it was in December at some point. And since I had been doing a little bit of work in WordPress, I knew enough that whenever I downloaded the plugin, installed it, and started kind of playing around with it for the first time, I realized that like, oh, I noticed a couple things that like, you know, could be improved, like small things, but I was like, oh, I know a thing, and decided, you know, to do a pull request. It was on GitHub, so put together a pull request and sent it in, and within a couple of days, I think Tim had merged it, and like when I saw that little like, you know, green check mark, accepted, merged, I was hooked, and decided like that this was something that was rewarding and fun and interesting that I wanted to kind of stay involved in. So it's still like, I thought like, you know, I would, you know, help a little bit kind of on the edges, help solve a couple of little problems, and it would be sort of a fun kind of thing to do. But like over time, especially this first couple of months, you know, Tim and I and a couple of other developers, a really talented developer named Jasper, you know, really ended up kind of becoming the couple of people who really like dedicated most of our time to kind of making this a thing and giving it shape and form. And, you know, before I knew it, like we were the ones that were doing it. Like I kept throughout the entire process assuming that at some point somebody who actually knew what they were doing was going to show up and take over, and it just never happened. And not to say that there were not people that like were better qualified that that didn't help us quite a bit on the project, because there was tons of people that did that. But once the plugin sort of got to a point where it was sort of ready to potentially be merged into WordPress, I sort of had those moments where the voice in your head, you know, the imposter syndrome that we all are a little bit familiar with, kept saying like that you're in over your head, like you're not the guy to do this, you're not the person to help make this happen. And at some point, somebody who knows what they're doing is either going to come in and take over, or is just going to like say like, this is all wrong, we got to start over, we got to redo this whole thing. And it just never really happened. You know, a couple people sort of came alongside and helped to coach us in the process, and helped us get over the hurdles that we needed to get over. But one of the things that I learned sort of in the process is that like I probably was selling myself a little bit short. Like our whole team, we were kind of selling ourselves short. That in retrospect, I was probably more prepared than I realized that I was, because as I had mentioned, I had been watching the release cycles for a little while, sort of watching how the WordPress core team, you know, operated, how features got merged. And so when it came time for that process for the responsive images plugin and that feature, I kind of already knew what to expect. I kind of knew how that process worked. And so I was able to sort of step in and help, you know, like just lead the meetings. And even if I wasn't writing a lot of the code for some of the trickier parts of the plugin, you know, I could show up and I could lead a meeting and I could do the part that I knew how to do. And that was enough. And that was, I think, probably one of the other lessons that I learned in the process is just like the discipline showing up again, like just to keep consistently having that discipline showing up. Another one of my favorite books, one I think it's on my bookshelf back here, that if you've not read is by an author named Stephen Pressfield, and it is the War of Art. And it is a great book for anybody who does any sort of creative anything. In that book, he talks about this idea of the resistance, right? So anytime that we do any sort of creative project, creative process, any sort of endeavor of that sort, and for him, he's an author, but I mean, it could be anything. There is sort of this natural, like, internal voice that will come up and try to tell you, like, you're not good enough to do this. You don't have, what it takes to do this. There's so many better things you could be doing with your time. This is irresponsible. And just to be prepared that, like, that voice is there, it's going to happen, and it's your choice whether you listen to that voice or you don't listen to that voice. And I remember distinctly towards the end of the responsive images plugin process, or the feature merge process, I distinctly remember having a conversation with myself when it was like there were some things that just weren't going well. There was parts that I was in over my head. I didn't know how we were going to solve this, like, tricky performance issue or something. And I was super intimidated, and that voice was like barking, like, in my head, like, super loud, that I remember having a conversation with myself and saying, like, this could fail because you aren't good enough and you don't know what you're doing, and it could just not work out. And you might embarrass yourself, and that's okay. Or two, you could, like, you don't have to do this at all. Like, you could quit, and you maybe save yourself potential embarrassment, but, like, it's going to fail then too, unless somebody else comes and picks it up. And so, I kind of had a conversation, and I said, I had to make a choice for myself and say, like, even though I feel like I'm not going to be able to make this happen and it's too big of a thing, like, I'm going to choose to keep pushing this forward until somebody else tells me no, or until I hit a roadblock that, like, I just can't get around. And that was a really important decision point, I think, in that process of tackling some big audacious goal that, like, I had no idea whether or not it was something that I could do. Because that fear is, like, a super real thing. And to sort of balance that, I think another thing that's really important in that process of, trying to make those sort of choices at times is another word of wisdom that I remember hearing from somebody. I don't remember who said it, but this idea of divesting yourself from the outcomes. And really what that means, I'll say it again, divest yourself from the outcomes. And so essentially what that idea is that, whenever you decide to put something out there into the world that's your own sort of creative work, realize at the end of the day that who you are as a person is not dependent on the outcomes of the product or the thing that you're producing, right? And this could be true when you're, giving advice to a friend or a family member, all the way to, when you're working on a project at work or whatever. I think thinking back, some of the times that I have done some of my worst work is when I've got my ego so wrapped up into, like, my idea or my the way I want things to turn out that I'm not able to, like, really do my best and to listen to the people around me, or, like, let that fear sort of kind of rise up and keep me from, like, maybe doing the right thing because my ego might get burned in the process. And so it's important to kind of keep that big picture, I think, of, the work is not who you are as a person, and divest yourself from the outcomes. That doesn't mean not to work any harder. Put all of your effort into a thing if you think that it's worth your effort, but just don't, like, let that define, whether or not you feel like you're a worthwhile person or not. And for me, I've been able to do that only because like I've lost some battles. I've been on the wrong side of some no-win situations, and I've had some of my, some of my dreams die, and like have realized, when you come through on the other side of that, that like you're still okay. Like we're still all like hanging out on this magic ball that's floating through space. And, I wake up every morning and breathe borrowed air that like was just there for me. And, that doesn't mean that there's not some real problems, but, whether like my project idea doesn't end up being the thing that gets made does not change the fact that like every day is magic, really, when you think about it. So that's something that's been really helpful, just sort of in helping me to stay sort of centered in those situations. But the other thing, and this is really important, is to find a community of support. Find people that you can pull around you. For that project, it took all of the energy of the folks who were involved, whether it was the responsive images community group, folks who advised along the way, WordPress, core developers that came in and helped point us in the right direction. Me, Jasper, Tim, and whoever else contributed to that project. There was, what was fun about especially working on WordPress, which is a big open source project that is kind of a global project, is there were nights where like I would go to bed working on a problem that I couldn't figure out, and then like my friend Peter, who's in Australia, would come up with a solution while I'm sleeping, and I'd wake up the next morning and be like, oh, thanks, Pete. That's it's fixed now. And like just to see how every time we hit barriers that we couldn't solve, somebody else stepped in with just that exact information or the right thing that we needed at the time, because there was a community of people that were supporting each other that would help. That ended up being probably one of the more rewarding parts of the whole process. And having people that you could celebrate with afterwards, and also, people that could help encourage and push the thing forward, was really key. Now for me and my story in this particular instance, it was a happy ending. So, I got to go to, the WordCamp US, the first WordCamp US, in Philadelphia, a year and some change ago, and be in the room when Scott Taylor on stage announced the features for WordPress 4.4 and announced responsive images was going to be in it, and to hear a bunch of people cheer for it and like just be overwhelmed by that experience. And it was really, really great. But I mean, to be honest, it was like so much of that was just super luck, right? Like being in the right place in the right time. The fact that I happened to give a talk on responsive images, and it was something that I was interested in, like a lot of things sort of aligned for that to happen. And so I want to acknowledge the fact that like sometimes you'll potentially take on something and decide to, ask the question, what needs to be done, and choose yourself and be disciplined about like actually doing the work and fighting the resistance and all of those things. And sometimes it's not going to go well. Sometimes the project's still going to fail. And Seth Godin wrote a blog post about this years ago that has stuck with me, where he would say, in his terms, pick yourself. And he did a follow-up where he said, I think it's called like picking yourself and responsibility or something. You should Google it and read that post, because he's way better with the words than I am. But basically the idea is that, taking responsibility does not necessarily mean things are going to work. Responsive images could have completely failed. There are lots of days where I still think that, it failed. Like, for example, now, a couple of years after that process, I had continued working on WordPress. I'm now one of the WordPress core developers. And, just week and a half, 2 weeks ago, we rolled out a minor release that included a fix that I was involved in that has created all kinds of problems, because to be quite honest, I didn't do a good job with that particular fix. And, you know, and so like that's an occasion where I decided to pick myself, I saw something that needed to be done, and it didn't work out. And now I'm like scrambling to try to like fix it and help, you know, and asking for help and those sorts of things. And that happens sometimes too. And so taking responsibility doesn't necessarily mean that things go well, but what it does mean is that you get to be a part of the process, right? So whether your goals happen or not, it's not left up to chance or left up to somebody else to do for you. You actually have a role to play. And so pick yourself and take responsibility. And so those are some of the lessons that I learned in the process. And hopefully those are some things that are maybe helpful to you in whatever way, whatever thing that you're doing. And so I would ask that question. So what about you, right? What are you going to do? What are the things that are in your attention collection, or what are the things that frustrate you, or the problems that you see, whether in your job, in you know, your life, in, you know, your city around you, where you can be a part of making something happen. What does a start look like for you? You know, again, not comparing yourself to somebody else's middle, but like, what is just that like quick thing that you could do to get the thing started? And what does it look like in that situation for you to show up? Where is there a community that's already sort of engaged in whatever the thing is that you are interested in? Can you team up with somebody else that's already working on that problem? You know, I didn't start the responsive images thing at all. Like Tim and this whole group of people were already working on it, and I just showed up and started helping out, and that was sort of my on-ramp into this thing. So is there something that already exists? I guarantee you that those people are looking for others to come and help support them in whatever that creative thing is. You know, I think we've seen this modeled over and over again, particularly, you know, recently, just a few miles from where I'm sitting here in St. Louis. You know, we saw a group of ordinary citizens who saw an injustice that they didn't want to kind of let stand. And whether you agree with the Black Lives Matter movement or not, I don't think anybody can deny that those ordinary citizens deciding that they were going to show up has made a gigantic impact on you know, just the conversations around some really important issues in our country. And you know, even just this weekend, just seeing, you know, millions of women specifically step out into cities and to make their voice heard, I think super inspiring. Whether it's big things like that or little things, like just, you know, taking responsibility for maybe being a little healthier this year, or whatever it is, I would encourage you to hopefully maybe take some of the lessons that I've learned here and maybe make something out of them. So thanks again for WPCampus Online for letting me be a part of this. It's been really fun to watch the whole organization, and I'm looking forward to seeing what you all do going forward. And if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to answer some. So thank you. All right, I see a couple of questions here at the bottom that I will answer. Yeah, Kevin, you just keep answering questions. I'll answer them. We'll hang out. It'll be cool. Okay, so first question is surprised that there isn't more of a push to get plugins contributed back to WordPress.org instead of just sharing custom plugins in GitHub repos. Is this a misperception? I don't know. It may be a little bit of a misperception, but there may be some accuracy to that as well. I think one of the things that I would say that I've noticed is I think a lot of developers like the process of developing using a lot of the tools and collaborating with a lot of the tools that are available in GitHub. And so that's where maybe they will host and do most of their contributing and that sort of thing. But then they also then put their plugin in the WP, the .org repo. And so they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. You can definitely do both of those things. So I don't know if that's an answer or not. So yeah, Paul makes a good point that I think people who aren't super familiar with using SVN as a part of their workflow may be a little intimidated into that process. There's some really good tutorials on how to do that. Like I'm a core developer and I barely know SVN. Like I use GitHub most of the time, or not GitHub, I use Git most of the time, even when I'm doing, WordPress core work, and then use SVN just for the commits and stuff. So there's definitely ways that you can be a part of that whole WordPress SVN infrastructure, and still use Git as sort of your main sort of workflows and those sort of tools. I'm gonna skip down for a second and then I'll come back to you, Kevin. What do you think is the most common reason that people are hesitant to get more involved in WordPress? That is a great question. And if anybody has their own answers, I would love to hear them because we are always looking for more people to get involved. But I would think that it's probably a couple of things. One is just knowledge, like knowing how to get involved. And to that end, I would say, joining the WordPress Slack team. I think you just go to chat.wordpress.org to find out information about that. And showing up and just like start paying attention to the main core channel and just seeing kind of the rolling conversation that happens there is one good place to get started. I think, if the tools, WordPress is now a 13-year-old project. And so a lot of the processes and tooling that's in place is, at this point, a little older than what, the kind of tools like GitHub and some of the things that that people are used to using every day. And so there's probably some intimidation to the tooling and some intimidation to it's just such a big project that people have no idea where to get started. WordPress as a project is broken into a bunch of different sort of focus areas that we call components. So I'm a maintainer for the media component, which in and of itself contains a lot of different sort of sub pieces, and each of those components or focus areas also have like weekly or fairly regular meetings to talk about tickets or specific issues that are just like focused in that area. And so that sometimes can be a place. So, contributor days at WordCamp can be a way to maybe get some of those questions answered. I know Paul says there's so much to be done and it can be a little overwhelming, and it is. It totally can be. I will tell you from my experience that like all of the people who do core development are generally, fairly friendly and really open. And if you, ping somebody and say like, hey, I'm looking for a way to help, people are usually pretty great about trying to help point you in the right direction. But I would say like, for me, the way that I kind of got started contributing, it was whenever I ran into a bug myself that I realized like, oh, well, this is actually a bug in WordPress, and, reported the bug and worked on a fix. So again, like not waiting for somebody else to fix the bug for me. It was like, oh, it's open source. I can fix this. I can write the code to make this happen. And so, so I would choose the thing that you're interested in, or the thing that the thing that bugs you. Again, your attention collection. Like, what are the things in WordPress that you would like to see? You've got an idea for and work on it. And maybe it's just a plugin, but maybe you get involved in WordPress core. It'd be great to have more people involved, particularly if you're interested in media and images. Would love to have more people involved. So Drupal has really been raising the bar in D8 in regards to getting started with development and contributing back. Does WP have any policies about keeping their project hackable? Kevin, I'm not exactly sure what you mean by, do we have any policies about keeping the project hackable? I think WordPress, if you've got more to say about that, please add on. But I think one of the core philosophies in WordPress is that you can do whatever you want with it. I mean, the source code is freely, openly available. You can hack it. There's lots of hooks and filters and different things that you can do to extend it and do the things that you want to do. So in terms of needing an IDE versus just a text editor, requiring Composer, are you saying that like WordPress, like it's hard to get started with WordPress without some specific tools? Is that the question? Oh, okay. I see. You're saying that's one of the things that's actually a good thing about WordPress is that you don't need to have a bunch of like dev dependencies to get started with it. Okay. Yeah. No. I mean, I think that's part of the core philosophy of WordPress, and it's something that we recognize is one of the reasons that WordPress has been able to gain such big market share in the CMS space. Is that it really is a tool that's open for people to hack, to do what they want to do with it. That a lot of people, even PHP developers, have gotten their start as like hacking WordPress, and there's goods and bads to that, but that's sort of part of the the roots of what makes WordPress, and I would anticipate that a little bit of that vibe is gonna continue, just because it's sort of a core part of what has made WordPress a thing. But there's some downsides to that as well. I mean, WordPress makes a big deal about backwards compatibility and making sure that as we update people's sites, we try really, really hard not to break plugins unless we have a good reason to, and so like sometimes that makes things harder and slower, and those are design trade-offs in some ways, and so there's a lot of people that would make arguments that WordPress should be doing more on the other side of things to like push things forward. So I don't know. Any other questions? Daniel, let's see. I think you may have a question here. Oh, just talking about the availability of people's time to really, like, there's a big investment of time to just probably understand like what even needs to be done. And I think you're right. That is, there's a big learning curve, and it's super intimidating, probably for a lot of people to get involved. And that's why I would say, I mean, just if that's something you're interested in, definitely reach out, and people would be happy to help get you rolling. So. No, Daniel, thank you for participating and helping to answer the question. It's really helpful. Thanks. Well, if there's no other questions, I think we can probably wrap up a couple minutes early. Thank you all again for listening. Hopefully this has been somewhat helpful.